Today's video is a very personal video, and it's been prompted by a friend of mine who put out a post a few days ago around could have been even been last week, around celibacy. And so really for me this is about my journey around celibacy. Now I've practiced deliberate celibacy a number of times in my life, and for various reasons. And there's one particular instance that I want to share today, and what it actually meant for me and what it did for me, not only as an individual, but also as a man, and how that helped shaped who I was in the world and what really became important to me, what became my values. And so for me, I'm going to go in, I'm going to list what this experience really did for me, this deliberate practice of celibacy. And before I do that, I want to share why I did it and what was really important for me. So very brief background. Some of you may know my background. I've done plenty of videos on this if you don't, but we all have variety to our background. We all have various stories that make up who we are, and we see ourselves through the lenses of those stories and through the happenings of those stories. And so often those stories, the ones that really impact us, are either extremely joyful and blissful, or they're extremely painful and they're really vested in deep fear and pain and suffering and challenge and despair, etc., etc. And so for me, I spent much of my life being very dishonest with myself, living in shadows. And when I was in intimate relationship, I wasn't true to those relationships. I wasn't true to myself. I wasn't true to that person. I was unfaithful in those relationships. And it caused me a lot of pain for various reasons. And a number of years ago, when I saw very clearly what unraveled, what transpired from my actions, when the woman that I was with really discovered and found out that I wasn't faithful, I wasn't in integrity, I wasn't keeping true to my word, I would be saying something and doing something else. Witnessing the pain in her really broke me down, and it caused me to be at a fork in the road. And it was to either continue the life that I was living in complete ignorance and arrogance and disregard for myself and my needs and the needs of others, or take a turn and venture into the unknown, venture into the mystery, and understand what is this life about and why am I actually behaving this way? Because this isn't normal behavior. I thought it was, but it wasn't. I thought this is what just every man does, or this is what happens in relationships. And my views of relationship at that point was very distorted. And it was volatile. It was extreme in expressions. And when I started to unpack that, I began to unpack what actually happened in my childhood and how I was mimicking and replicating and repelling at the same time all of these experiences that I had in childhood. And so when I went down this path and I started practicing celibacy, and by the way, I'd practiced celibacy, deliberate celibacy, well before this. In fact, in my early 20s, I started, early 20s. I had practices around no masturbation and what that looked like, and I would only ejaculate if I was with women. So my sexuality was I was experimenting and experiencing sexuality from different perspectives for quite some time, from a younger age. And one particular instance where I was celibate for a lengthened period of time, I began to discover so much more about me. My relationship changed to sex itself, to sexual expression. It really changed. My relationship to my sexuality changed, to my sexual organ changed, to my penis. That changed completely. I started seeing myself very differently. I started behaving differently in the sense that I wasn't so erratic in my behavior. I wasn't so confused. I wasn't driven by sex. I would be able to sit down with a woman and be present to her and not have this expectation or these running thoughts about, I need to have sex with you, or we should be having sex, or we could be having sex. Now at the beginning, it was very strange for me, because I had gone into this particular phase of my life with an intention. The intention was a no feminine diet. It was no sex, no masturbation, no pornography. I hadn't really been watching pornography at that point anyway. I gave that up many years before. And so that wasn't too difficult. And the masturbation piece wasn't too difficult either. But deliberately seeing women differently, deliberately seeing people differently, and how I would relate to them. My relationship with the feminine changed massively, massively. I ceased to come with an agenda. I ceased to be meeting a woman with, oh, we could be having sex. It was just, there was more presence. There was this whole, my whole relationship to sexuality really shifted. And it shifted because I created the space for that to occur. I created an opportunity for me to see myself and sexuality and people differently, women differently. Instead of objectifying them, I was able to subjectify them, see them for who they were, not just beyond something that would satisfy me. I began to see how hyper selfish I was, that all of my actions, the subtleties of my actions, or the subtleties of my behaviors and the subtle thoughts that I was having, unconscious and conscious, were driving me towards something. Now, it gave me a deeper appreciation and a deeper value for the sacredness of sex as well. Of course, sex is driven by our need to reproduce, our biological need to reproduce. It also feels extremely good. It's one of those activities, those experiences that can get us deep into flow state, which is one of the most tremendous human states to be in, peak potential states. It's one of those states that can literally, we've heard many authors and philosophers say, and ancient mystics, it brings us to God. It helps us touch God, understand God, know God, be God, feel God. And what was happening for me, I was beginning to realize that I had this physical attachment to the physical component of sex only. And as I pulled myself away and distanced myself and created space, I began to learn more about me. I began to see the various perspectives that sex offered. I ceased to come from manipulation. Again, the subtleties of behavior. I began to be more open, more transparent. There was no agenda. I began to speak with greater truth. It was a time of deep creation for me as well. I harnessed all that sexual energy I had, and I was practicing specific breath practices as well. I was sitting in silence. I was deliberately focusing on what was happening within me. I was paying attention to the inner workings of my mind and my body. But I remember that time of my life, I was hyper creative. I was able to take all of this energy that wasn't repressed because I was very aware of it. There's a difference there. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't I was angry at myself or hating sex, or it wasn't that I was in shame. I literally wanted to experience a different version of life in reference to sexuality. And man, did I create. I created programs, I wrote books, I read, I listened, I felt more. My senses became acute. It was like I was on an LSD trip. It was an amazing experience that gave me deeper insight into my own sexuality. Because our sexuality is not just the act of sex. Our sexuality is our personality. It's our mind in motion, or our brain in motion, which is our mind. It's how we express. It's how we give and receive love. I started giving and receiving in very different ways. I found that I had more meaning and fulfillment in my life. I felt deeper connected to my own sense of purpose. I felt clarity. I didn't have confusion. I wasn't nervous around women. I wasn't struggling to communicate. I didn't have that agenda. I became clearer in my own vessel. I respected and revered the feminine and women and myself at deeper levels. I was able to speak truth with greater clarity and greater confidence. All because I began to shift and see the relationship that I had to my sexuality from a very different vantage point, a very different perspective. I didn't obsess over sex. Now, given during that time my body said, hey, it's time to ejaculate. Apologies. Okay, we're back, we're on. Okay, good. Patience is a virtue. So my body would say, hey, you need to ejaculate. I'd have wet dreams, but it was something that was involuntary. It was my body just doing what it needed to do. My point is that everything in my life became richer and deeper in appreciation. I began to see the world very, very differently. And so there's an opportunity to also go deeper into that. There's an opportunity for you to look at yourself in reference. How are you behaving? How are you showing up in the world? How are you treating yourself? How are you seeing and objectifying potential partners? How are you seeing different people in the world? How do you relate to sex? What does it do for you? How does it drive you? Why is it important to you? All of these questions, they get answered. It's not even about answer, they become revealed to you when you are able to just go into a practice of, let me step back, create space and observe. Let me not be attached to how something needs to be. I also discovered, and this was really interesting, my self-worth and my value. I place so much of my worth and my value on having sex, being with different women, being with women, sexual performance. And so all of that started to dissipate because I didn't have that as a reference point in my life anymore. I didn't have that opportunity to be consistently having sex and connecting with women in that physical, sexual, intimate way. I didn't have that opportunity. So I had to observe myself and say, where else can I derive my self-worth? I started to see how, quote unquote, codependent I was and how reliant I was on people validating me through sexuality and through sex and through the aesthetic function of sex. So much shifted for me. I was able to see so much of myself. My heart opened as a man. And if anything, my sexual connection to my cock became deeper. It became more powerful, more connected. And when I say power, I don't mean controlling, autocratic power, oppressive power, subjugating power. I'm talking about the clarity of the channel, the understanding, the flow, the connection, how I would utilize my sex in the world. That was very deep and profound for me. And so a lot of that changed. The shame around not having sex or having sex, it all shifted. And so how I related began to shift massively. And that sense of self-worth, how I derived my value, my self-esteem, my value in the world, that began to shift. I began to go more internal. My sense of self began to be derived from within. And that was deeply empowering for me as well. I was able to witness myself and witness others from a clear place of substance. And so I ask you, can you go to that place? Can you see and relate to your sexuality in a different way? And how we do that is that we create space. For some of you, it may be a no sex diet. It may be a no feminine diet or no masculine diet. It may be creating complete space from sexual expression in terms of masturbation and pornography and having sex and flirtation. I stopped all of that. But my sexual expression, it didn't get stunted. It went into creating and serving and giving others, feeling compassion, empathy, and that depth. And that was so empowering for me. Now, I can speak to this for days. I just ask you to ask yourself, just observe, how do you relate to your sexuality? How is your self-worth derived in relation to not how you have sex in terms of the act, but what's behind the need to have sex? And sex is a beautiful technology. It's a beautiful access point. Yes, it serves us biologically and it serves the human race and it allows us to flourish and live. And there's something deeper behind that. There's a sacredness to sexuality. There's a rawness and a vulnerability. I became more comfortable with my own body. The body shame dropped because I began to see myself differently. Power and blessings to you, beautiful people. I'll leave it there for now. I'll leave you with that. There's something here that I will say.